I think it's fair to say that Halo 3 was a fitting end to Bungie's incredible trilogy. While it may start out perhaps a little slower than I personally would have liked, its second half is absolutely bananas and features some of the best missions not just in Halo 3's campaign, but in the entire series. And that makes ranking its missions by quality a tricky proposition, as there's quite a few levels with quite a few fantastic moments to think about. But I'm going to give it a go regardless, starting with what I think is Halo 3's worst mission, before working my way through the rest of them until we arrive at what I reckon is the best of the bunch. It may come as a surprise to some of you, especially given my previous video analysing the mission, but kicking things off at number 9 is not, as many of you might have expected, Cortana, but rather Halo 3's second mission, Crow's Nest. My biggest bone of contention with Crow's Nest is that it feels a little bland. In some ways, I suppose it's a bit harsh putting this mission where it is on the list for that reason, as it doesn't do anything especially terrible, but at the same time, it doesn't really do anything particularly interesting either. The opening scene during which the Prophet of Truth appears on the monitors prior to the base being attacked, and the introduction of the drones I think are its best moments, but beyond that, you'll spend a fair amount of time running backwards and forwards through grey corridors, engaging in encounters that I'd describe as bog standard. Given Halo 3 is the final game in Bungie's trilogy, I'd have expected a more explosive opening to the game, designed to get your blood pumping before things continue to ramp up as you progress, but ultimately, what you get between Crow's Nest and the mission which precedes it is the video game equivalent of treading water, two levels which feel like they're going through the motions before things later begin to get a lot more exciting. Given the comments I just made about Crow's Nest, it probably won't come as a great surprise to hear that 8th place is occupied by Sierra 117. As far as opening missions in the Halo trilogy go, it's quite the refreshing change compared to the Pillar of Autumn in Combat Evolved and the Armory and Cairo Station in 2, with the lush jungle and its surroundings an environment I would have enjoyed spending a lot more time in. What puts it a hair's breadth ahead of Crow's Nest for me is its set pieces, with the sequence featuring multiple pelicans and the assault on the dam both doing a good job of mixing things up in between shootouts in the jungle itself. On the flip side, I can't help but feel like there needed to be a bit more to it than there actually is. By the time I finish clearing the dam, rescue Sergeant Johnson and fend off the Covenant reinforcements, I'm pumped up and ready for a few more sections prior to reaching the evac zone, but instead Sierra 117 comes to a very abrupt close. A further encounter or 3 fighting through the jungle to do just that I think would have been enough, or alternatively combining Sierra 117 with Crow's Nests into one longer mission would have probably done the trick as well. In at number 7 is one of the Halo series' most notorious missions, Cortana. My view has always been that Cortana is essentially the Library 2.0, another level I'm not a huge fan of, and I'm not convinced it's something many people were asking for prior to Halo 3's release. In recent times, however, my opinion of Cortana has softened somewhat, and honestly, if I'd made this video a year ago, I can almost guarantee it would have been rock bottom on my list. What's helped change my mind more recently is thinking about it in story terms and coming to detest the environment in which it takes place a little less compared to my previous view of it. Now that's not to say there aren't issues with both. The moments during which you're slowed to a crawl by Cortana and the Gravemind are infuriating, and the level design and colour palette paired with the Flood themselves can make proceedings at times a confusing mess. But on the other hand, the cutscene during which Master Chief rescues Cortana is fan-blooming-tastic, and at least for the first half of the mission, the flood-infested High Charity is a disturbing sight to behold. Thinking about it, Cortana in some ways suffers from the opposite issues that Sierra 117 has. Whereas that mission I think could have been fleshed out a little more, Cortana without doubt outstays its welcome and goes on far longer than it should. There's little variety as you make your way through the Covenant City, and because most of your encounters with the Flood are fairly similar, it ends up feeling like you're doing the same thing over and over again. The story beats and the initial impact the environment has are in my view enough to keep it off the bottom of the list, but the lack of variety and its length mean I could never in good conscience place it any higher. Tsavo Highway is without doubt where Halo 3 begins to pick up following a relatively slow start, which is why it finds itself taking up 6th place. I really like the start of the mission in particular, after the aforementioned opening to the game, which features a pair of narrow missions. Exiting the caves and driving out into the much wider expanse alongside a squad of Marines is always a real breath of fresh air, and it's the point during my first playthrough many moons ago where 3 really began to feel like a proper Halo game. The rest of the level is a lovely open affair, although during my recent playthrough I did find myself equal parts frustrated and wetting myself laughing by this sequence of events.
pushing to the town of Boyd, Chief. Resupply birds will meet you in the next valley. Resupply birds will meet you in the next valley. Resupply birds will meet you in the next valley. Resupply birds will meet you in the next valley.
Endless death loops aside, what you get with Tsavo Highway is a well-paced affair which mixes up its encounters at just the right moments. The opening vehicle section is a long one, but it's followed swiftly by a sequence during which you find yourself under siege by the Covenant, before another shorter vehicle section kicks in to bring things home. Perhaps my only major criticism would be that the arc later features much of the same in a very similar environment, but arguably does it better and over a more sustained period of time, which takes some of the edge off repeat playthroughs. But I think it would be unfair to mark Tsavo Highway down too much for that, given how much it gets right to begin with. As far as missions featuring the Flood as the primary antagonist go, Floodgate is one of my favourites, which is why it finds itself in a very respectable 5th place on my list. I think what really sets Floodgate apart for me is the very stark transition that occurs between it and previous mission The Storm. The Storm, as we'll get to shortly, is a rather triumphant affair, as you take down numerous Covenant squads and eventually destroy their anti-air defences, but almost immediately after, the Flood appear and suddenly you have an entirely new problem to deal with. As such, during Floodgate you find yourself revisiting areas you made your way through during the previous mission, except everything is now much darker in tone. The skies darken, fires rage, and the roars of the Flood can be heard ringing out around you. It's a jarring change in atmosphere, which I think works all the better because you're witnessing that change within environments you are already familiar with. The arrival of an elite strike team to assist Master Chief and the Arbiter, as well as the reveal of the new pure Flood forms and the return of 343 Guilty Spark, also assures the mission ends on a high note, but as one of the shortest missions in Halo 3, I would have liked the runtime to have been perhaps a touch longer than it is. I know that sounds a bit rich coming from someone who just criticised Cortana for being a Flood mission which goes on far too long, but because Floodgate is a more varied experience, I don't think adding an extra 10 minutes or so to its length would have been a bad thing at all. I actually feel perhaps a little guilty about giving Halo 4th place, but allow me to try and explain why I just about think it deserves to be where it is. Looking at the first half of the mission, there's actually not too much to write home about. Fighting the Flood out on the snow with the support of Sentinels as you ascend a Forerunner structure is reasonably entertaining and very reminiscent of Combat Evolved's 2 Betrayals and/or Assault on the Control Room, but it's nothing we haven't seen before. The cutscenes and boss battle with 343 Guilty Spark, which take up the middle of Halo, are pretty great, although up until that point, nothing occurs which I would say puts it a level above many of those I've already talked about during this video. What sets Halo aside is its ending, as you hop in a Warthog one last time to finally make your escape, having activated Installation 08. I don't think there can be any argument that this scene is a direct reference to the end of Combat Evolved's The Maw, except here Bungie turns it up to 11 for a sequence which is much longer and far more spectacular. It's a wonderfully exciting way to cap off the trilogy, and much more interesting than, say, a boss fight, and to me at least, it also feels like Bungie was trying to right the wrongs of the Maw's own Warthog run. There's more room to manoeuvre, it generally feels like a more forgiving affair, and they even include a few sections with 3 lanes you can choose between travelling down, except unlike those in the Maw, they feel better designed and it's less likely you'll get stuck as you move through them. All in all, Halo is absolutely a mission of 2 halves, but I think its second half is strong enough that its place a little higher on my list is, in the end, justified. In third place is The Storm, a mission which is a complete assault on the senses from beginning to end. If Tsavo Highway was the mission for me where the game really started to feel like a Halo title, then The Storm is the one I always remember as the mission during which I really began to feel like Halo 3 was doing things that simply would not have been possible on the previous generation of hardware. In this regard, one moment in particular stands out from the crowd, and that is of course the battle against the Scarab around the mission's midpoint. To this day, it is still one of of my favourite encounters in the series. It's such an open, dynamic sequence, and wherever you look there's something exciting happening. The Halo trilogy did a consistently good job of scaling up encounters as the series progressed, but the arrival of the Scarab and the subsequent fight to take it down was beyond anything I'd ever expected going into the game. There is something of a lull in proceedings immediately after as you move through a series of uninspiring indoor environments, but the fight to the anti-air defences is a well-designed section, and I really enjoy watching workers wearing hard hats get stuck in despite not really being equipped to deal with the situation at hand. I also can't finish talking about the storm without mentioning its ending cutscene, which is one of the best in the series. Admiral Hood launches his counterattack on the Covenant forces surrounding the Forerunner artifact, the Prophet of Truth succeeds in opening a giant slipspace portal, and the Flood make their first appearance. Halo 3 severely lacks any scenes like this prior to the storm, and it's a fantastic way of capping off the first half of the game, while also building plenty of excitement for its second. Narrowly missing out on the number 1 spot, but nonetheless taking a very respectable second place, is the Ark. The Ark is one of the 2 missions in Halo 3 which I think embodies everything that makes the series so completely and utterly fantastic. From a gameplay standpoint, it has a sniper sequence, plenty of vehicular combat, another Scarab battle, and a surprisingly entertaining Forerunner section, and its set pieces are no slouch either, with the arrival of the Forward Unto Dawn halfway through the mission, yet another example of Bungie using the 360's increased horsepower to add those extra flourishes that simply would not have been possible on the original Xbox. The Ark isn't all about gameplay and spectacle either. It's also chock full of interesting story beats and lore, including the terminals detailing the story of the Didact and the Librarian, and the scenes between Master Chief and the 343 Guilty Spark towards its conclusion. Halo 3's latter stages also feature an incredible number of callbacks to previous missions in the series, and the Ark is no exception. Its opening is reminiscent of Truth and Reconciliation, it has hints of the Silent Cartographer during its middle, and the journey through the Forerunner facility flanked by 343 Guilty Spark brings back memories of the library. It is both a love letter to everything great about the series and a display of how much more could be done compared to Combat Evolved and 2 on the Xbox, and for that reason it remains in my view one of the best Halo missions ever created. After such glowing praise for the Ark, you might be wondering how any level could possibly top it, but there is one mission that manages just that, and it is of course my favourite level in Halo 3, the Covenant. When I previously covered the Covenant in its very own video, I said it may just be the greatest Halo mission ever created, and my opinion hasn't changed one bit. If the Ark is a love letter to Halo games past, then the Covenant is the grand romantic gesture. It is absolutely extraordinary. Like the Ark, it contains incredible variety, but arguably to a much greater extent. You have an opening beach landing, now a staple of the series, vehicular sections, you take to the skies in a Hornet not once but twice, the second time to fight 2 Scarabs, and there's even a brief section where you fight alongside the Flood. And as if that wasn't enough, it features nearly every one of Halo 3's weapons and vehicles, as well as plenty of callbacks to previous missions in the series, with the beach scene reminiscent of the Silent Cartographer, and the Scorpion run through the snow a dead ringer for a similar sequence featured in Assault on the Control Room. You might think it sounds like there's almost too much packed into this one mission, but what really helps set the Covenant apart is how well it's paced, even with everything in the kitchen sink thrown in. It features amazing set pieces throughout and a host of interesting narrative moments, but Bungie expertly speeds up and slows down events at just the right moments to ensure that every new encounter lands with just as much impact as those which came before it. All in all, I think it would be fair to say that the Covenant isn't just the best mission in the Halo series, but one of the greatest levels in any first-person shooter full stop, and if another Halo mission ever comes along which manages to equal or even top it, then we should consider ourselves very lucky indeed. Thanks for watching the video, boys, girls and Spartans. If you enjoyed it, do consider liking, subscribing, and most importantly letting me know if you agree or disagree with my rankings, and hopefully I'll catch you all again soon.